After Fidel Castro repudiated free elections and nationalized $1 billion of American property in Cuba, President Dwight Eisenhower decided to remove him from office by having the CIA overthrow Castro. The CIA began training anti-Castro Cubans to invade Cuba and precipitate a rebellion to oust Castro. During the 1960 campaign, intelligence officials briefed the Democratic and Republican presidential and vice presidential candidates on the CIA plans. Nixon hoped the CIA would act before the 1960 election, but they did not. Within 10 days of Kennedy's election, he learned the full details of the operation. While CIA planned to keep the invasion secret, the training of some of the anti-Castro Cubans in the Florida Everglades leaked out. Miami editors knew of the plans but kept quiet until the New York Times broke the story in January 1961. The CIA director assured the president the plan would succeed, and the exposure in the press increased the pressure on JFK to either approve the plan or cancel it. The Joint Chiefs of Staff learned about the operation in January 1961 as it got exposed in the press. However, the Joint Chiefs agreed with the CIA that the plan would work. The Joint Chiefs recommended the landing take place at Trinidad, further east, that had a landing strip, and the geography appeared better suited for an invasion. Unfortunately, the CIA rejected the suggestions and opted for the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy went along with the CIA plan, but opposed any use of American military personnel in the operation. On April 17, 1961, 1,500 anti-Castro Cubans landed. No uprising of the Cuban people took place, and the invasion force landed too far west to link up with the existing anti-Castro guerrillas. Cuban defense forces sank the supply ship with most of the weapons and shot down several of the planes sent as support, killing 4 Americans hired by the CIA. Quickly, Castro's forces killed or captured the invasion force. The United States denied any involvement, and Khrushchev threatened retaliatory action if the United States did not stop the invasion. The invasion and the CIA operation was a total failure that embarrassed President Kennedy. In the wake of the Bay of Pigs, the CIA made plans for another invasion and tried to sabotage the Cuban regime with no real success. The United States sent a special envoy, and he negotiated with Castro for the release of the surviving 1,200 anti-Castro Cubans for $14 million in medical supplies and heavy equipment. The crisis developed in part from Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's perception of President Kennedy. When the Soviet leader met JFK in Vienna in the spring of 1961, he remained unimpressed with the relative youth of the American. In the early 1960s, the Russians had limited ability to develop ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles that could hit the United States from the Soviet Union. The Soviet premier was under attack on the left from Mao, the Chinese Communist leader, for not being more aggressive in dealing with the Americans. In 1961, CIA failure at the Bay of Pigs to overthrow Fidel Castro, with about 1,500 anti-Castro Cubans, further convinced the Soviet leader of the limitations of President Kennedy's abilities in foreign affairs. Khrushchev saw an opportunity to redress a strategic balance of power by placing nuclear warheads on shorter-range missiles in Cuba, which would have the advantage of helping Castro by discouraging another invasion attempt, but also allow the Soviet Union to redress its limited ICBM capability by placing nuclear weapons closer to the United States. While the Cuban Missile Crisis had the potential to escalate into a nuclear confrontation between the United States and the USSR, and possibly a devastating World War III, there were several restraints on the behavior of the United States and the USSR. President Kennedy wanted to treat the events in Cuba as a political problem rather than a military one, where there was a possibility of compromise acceptable to both sides. Neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev wanted to escalate the crisis into a military confrontation. Khrushchev had previously shown restraint in the fall of 1961 on a confrontation of American and Soviet tanks at Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. During the crisis, President Kennedy relied on the National Security Council for advice. He appointed his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to chair the meetings. Initially, most of the members of the committee favored an airstrike as the most feasible means to remove the missiles before they became operational. The advisors and President Kennedy rejected the suggestion from American Ambassador to the United Nations Adlai Stevenson for negotiations and a trade of American missile sites in Europe for removal of Soviet missiles in Cuba as too weak a response. However, to avoid direct military confrontation, President Kennedy opted for a joint strategy of naval blockade and negotiations with Khrushchev. The blockade kept additional missiles and military supplies from entering Cuba. A resolution of the crisis appeared stalled because the Soviet leader initially asked for a no-invasion pledge in exchange for removing the missiles, but then increased his demands requiring the removal of American missiles and Turkey. By quietly agreeing to remove American missiles from Turkey 6 months after the Russians removed their missiles from Cuba, and providing a public no-invasion pledge, it allowed both leaders to come out as winners. The Cuban Missile Crisis also convinced Khrushchev that Fidel Castro was a hothead who could lead the Russians into a war they did not want. The Soviet leader withdrew other weapons from Cuba, fearing that Castro might use them to create a confrontation with the United States. Ironically, the crisis led to negotiations between the United States and the USSR, culminating in the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 that limited the testing of nuclear weapons. President Kennedy met with civil rights leaders during the 1960 campaign and promised support for equal rights for African Americans. Once elected, the president favored a moderate course of action to avoid alienating Southern white Democrats who controlled congressional committees, and because JFK would need their votes in 1964. Events went beyond the president's control. On February 1, 1960, 4 black freshmen at the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College in Greensboro attempted to integrate the lunch counter at their local Woolworths. Police arrested them, and the sit-down movement began. Within weeks, thousands of students started sitting in at lunch counters in 15 cities in 5 southern states, in what became the grassroots efforts in 1960 and 1961 to end segregation in the South. This led to the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In the spring of 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, a Northern African American civil rights organization, started the campaign to integrate transportation in the South by sponsoring the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides tested Southern compliance with federal legislation against segregation in interstate travel. White mobs in Alabama attacked the Freedom Riders, burning a bus in Anniston and later beating up the travelers when the bus reached Birmingham. The governor of Alabama, John Patterson, promised the Kennedy administration that he would protect the riders, but he did not, and when they reached Montgomery, another mob attacked and beat the travelers. These actions forced the Kennedy administration to partially intervene, sending some federal officials along with the Freedom Riders, but they were also beaten. In the end, Governor Patterson agreed to provide protection to the Mississippi border, and once in that state, all the Freedom Riders were promptly arrested for violating that state's segregation laws, filling the prisons with Freedom Riders. Young people continued to board buses, and the campaign electrified the civil rights movement, forcing the reluctant President Kennedy, through his brother Robert Kennedy, to take action to protect civil rights for African Americans in the South. For President Kennedy, the major confrontation took place in September 1962 when Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black dismissed a legal challenge by Mississippi to the admission of James Meredith to the University of Mississippi. Governor Ross Barnett refused to allow it. President Kennedy attempted to negotiate with Barnett, but the governor held tough, making promises that someday he would accept it. Kennedy did not want to repeat Ike's actions at Little Rock in 1957, but circumstances in Oxford, Mississippi required him to do so. James Meredith arrived at Oxford on September 30th, 1962, supported by 300 federal marshals and a deputy attorney general. President Kennedy went on national television to announce the peaceful integration of the University of Mississippi. However, white mobs attacked the marshals and started a riot in which 2 people were killed. State forces took no action, and some believe a radio address by Governor Barnett encouraged the violence that broke out in Oxford. Reacting to the violence, President Kennedy urged restraint by the marshals, but ordered 16,000 troops to occupy the town of 10,000. In addition to the 2 deaths of innocent bystanders, 166 marshals and 40 soldiers were injured. 200 people were arrested, and James Meredith successfully started his freshman year at Ole Miss. The crisis over integration got played out again a year later, when 2 African American students attempted to integrate the University of Alabama. The governor of Alabama, George Wallace, resisted a court order to integrate the college. He called for segregation now, segregation forever, and stood on the doorsteps of the University of Alabama to prevent integration. However, Nicholas Katzenbach from the Attorney General's office escorted 2 students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, to their dormitory and integrated the college. President Kennedy federalized the Alabama National Guard, sent 100 troops to the college to prevent violence. He stationed 1,600 additional troops a short distance away in case they were needed, and ordered 400 U.S. Army troops from Fort Benning to provide backup. Integration of the college proceeded without violence. Meanwhile, Myrlie Evers was watching television in Jackson, Mississippi, 4 hours after the Wallace confrontation and the announcement of the integration at the University of Alabama. She was waiting for her husband, Medgar Evers, a local NAACP leader, to come home. As he walked from his car, a rifle shot rang out, killing Evers in front of his wife and children. Events like these, the beatings and killings of civil rights activities, led African American leaders to lobby the Kennedy administration to take firmer action. In the spring of 1963, a dramatic campaign for civil rights began in Birmingham, Alabama, led by Martin Luther King, who wrote his letter from the Birmingham jail while imprisoned for his civil rights work in the city. About this time, the president negotiated with Democratic and Republican leaders to bring forward a proposed civil rights bill over the objections of Southern Democrats. This eventually became the 1964 Civil Rights Act. In an effort to encourage passage of the legislation, Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders decided to stage a public demonstration in Washington. President Kennedy tried to persuade the civil rights leaders to call off the demonstration, fearing it might lead to violence, or it would backfire, leading to further Southern resistance to the proposed legislation. The march in August of 1963 became the famous March on Washington, in which 250,000 people participated. A. Philip Randolph had proposed a similar march in 1941, but President Roosevelt persuaded him to call it off in exchange for an executive order opening jobs for African Americans in defense-related industries. Randolph participated in the 1963 march and spoke on the podium. A number of white and African American civil rights leaders gave speeches, but Martin Luther King captivated the audience and the nation with his "I Have a Dream" speech.